I've been married to a 90% disagreeable man for 42 years. Many times I've packed my bags, but I've never followed through. I dream of being on my own, doing the little things in life without constantly being questioned. If it wasn't his idea, it isn't a good idea. As he's gotten older, his drinking has become a problem. I'm sure he's an alcoholic. His rule is the first beer isn't cracked until 4:30. It used to be 5, and then game on. By the time supper comes about, he's 100% disagreeable, and every year finds me getting more and more depressed. The question is how to know when to go.
Well, it sounds like you know that it's time to go. You just are not willing to pay the price of going. So this is getting to the heart of all human activity, which is that everything is a cost-benefit analysis. So you've been running for 42 years a cost-benefit analysis on remaining in this relationship. So there is a trade that is maintaining this equilibrium, or the equilibrium would not be this stable. So this is where it can get really interesting, and I would need to know a lot more about your particular situation to figure out what exactly is contributing to that sense of some kind of sense of fair trade, or this would not be stable. So usually, in a lot of cases, that is a straight financial situation. So particularly women who find themselves in a long-term unhappy marriage, they're staying in that long-term unhappy marriage because they're so financially enmeshed with their partner, often to the point of financial dependence. So they don't have an independent income that they can fall back on. They don't have any sort of, career path that they could easily move into. And particularly if you've been married for 42 years, that puts you somewhere likely in your 60s or even 70s. And so, you're likely looking at some difficult market prospects as far as managing your own financial affairs. So that very often is something that contributes to women putting up with this kind of situation. Not that men can't as well. Men can also be financially dependent, and people can be mutually dependent for lots of other reasons. They own property together that's really complicated to disaggregate. There are children involved. There are all kinds of different things, religious expectations. So you kind of have to look at in a very clear-eyed, courageous sort of way what the factors are that have essentially been tilting the balance towards stay all this time, because it doesn't sound like your happiness is in question. It sounds like you're very clearly not happy. He's very clearly showing signs of progressive alcoholism, which is a progressive process. It's never going to get better. He's, if he's moving up his time of when he's cracking his first beer, that's just going to get earlier and earlier. And unless he completely interrupts that process by abstaining altogether, it's just going to continually get worse. And 90% disagreeable is pretty disagreeable. So you're staying there for some number of reasons. You can also be staying there out of sheer personality distortion, and this is one of the reasons that we talk so much about personality on every show, and I particularly am obsessed with it, because when we are really distorted on certain personality dimensions, we wind up putting up with things outside of what we should be on average for the species putting up with. So if he's 90% disagreeable, it's likely that you're pretty agreeable. Someone who's extremely disagreeable, if they're in a long-term relationship, is almost always married to a saint. So we're going to put you at least well above average agreeableness for a female. And that's contributing to some major distortion about how you were running the CB on getting out of this thing, because agreeable people stay way too long. They don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to upset anybody. They underestimate their needs and their requirements, and they devalue their own happiness. They're basically going through life saying, oh, well, everybody else's well-being is more important than mine. Everybody else gets a bigger share of the pie. I'll take what's left over. That is what agreeableness is. And so if you're running a fairly high degree of agreeableness, and if you're pretty conscientious, and so you're taking care of the messes that are created by him, and you don't want to subject everything to a bunch of chaos, and you're emotionally stable, like all of these things can make an otherwise very marketable person stay in a bad relationship for a long time. So if the question is how to know when to go, it's really, that's not quite the question you should be asking. The question is, are you willing to pay the price of leaving? And so far you haven't been, because you haven't. And so just looking at what that price would be, and if you're willing to change your willingness to pay, that's really the only thing that can move the needle here. And with this kind of situation, both Dr. Lisle and I are always reminding people that you don't have to do anything drastic to see a really big change in your life. So you don't have to make any big declarations. You don't have to file any major paperwork. You don't even have to announce anything. You just tell this guy, hey, I'm going to go stay with my sister for a while, or I just really need some time on my own. I'm going to go on a trip, or whatever it is that you can manage within your financial parameters and your openness and everything else that just gets you a little space out of this thing, where you can get in better touch with what your emotions about the relationship really are, and start to get a sense of how you feel when you're apart from him, because that is going to contribute to running a more accurate cost-benefit analysis on ending the whole thing altogether. So don't make a big decision when a small decision would do, and the first small decision is just to take some time away from it.
Absolutely fascinating. You're reminding me when I was a kid, when we used to drive to school, my mom would put on a radio show called the Dr. Laura Show, and there was this.
Oh, good old Dr. Laura.
Yeah, it was this like marriage and family therapist, and she was actually nationally syndicated, so she had quite an audience.
Sure,
and,
I remember her very well.
People would call in and ask her about these questions, and this was actually a fairly common question. Maybe not the alcoholic and abuse, maybe not the alcoholic and the disagreeable, but it was a very common question, and I just remember getting frustrated every time I'd listen, even though I was a teenager, and. The way she would put it out is, you've got to find out what happened in your life that's traumatic, that's causing you to want to be with this guy.
For God's sake. See, this is what it is. This is psychodynamic BS, and that is absolutely the learning theory world that most psychologists are immersed in, and most people culturally just assume to be true. And certainly if someone's going to get a nationally syndicated show, that's they are going to be preaching that kind of gospel. That's the Dr. Phil gospel too. It's, you have intimacy issues because of all of this damage that you accumulated in your childhood, and you just need to learn to communicate better in your relationship because of those deep-seated emotional intimacy issues, and you need to unwind the damage of the past. Oh my God, it's so misguided and frustrating and detrimental to people's well-being and happiness over time. It makes me it turns me into the psychology Hulk.
Now, one thing in your explanation, this is brilliant. One thing I wanted to ask is, let's suppose the lady. I mean, it doesn't sound like that she's in fear, and that's why not she's leaving. But of course, I don't know her situation. But if there was somebody who's in a similar situation, and the reason that their cost benefit is skewed towards not leaving is that they fear a threat or some violence, what advice did you have then?
Yeah, well, that's going to be very situationally dependent, and that very often is part of the deal, because, she may be running with some accumulated evidence that he responds in a very unstable way if she's packed her bags and threatened to leave before, and he's gotten real shitty about it, then of course those are pieces of information that go into the cost benefit about whether it makes sense to leave or not. So I don't get that vibe from this particular question, but I've certainly talked to clients in that situation before, and it's not entirely uncommon. And if he is an alcoholic and he's becoming more unstable as a feature of that progressed alcoholism, which is likely, then that's, worth considering. So depending on her financial situation, the answer to that's going to be different, depending on her, essentially what kind of position of power she's in. But this is when we lean on friends, we lean on family if she has it. You find somebody who can help you stage an exit, and show up and support you and provide provide safe haven for you while you get away from him. And depending on how nasty it is and how dangerous he is, you might have to, really orchestrate this in fine detail before you make your move. So you're waiting for him to pass out, and then you're leaving, and you're leaving no sign of where you've gone. Like it really depends how extreme it is. Mm-hmm. In this case, because it doesn't sound like he's that dangerous or he's that unhinged, I think it's probably good enough to just have a pack of friends show up and help you when you're moving out, or to just kind of bluff him with this very like I'm suggesting, just an early experiment to take some time away if she is still feeling some dissonance about it. If there are good things about the relationship that she's hanging on to, which there may be, and she still has some dissonance about it, that's why it's important to take the time too. So you just put him to sleep by saying, hey, I'm just going to go stay with my good friend in Florida for a while. I just need some sun. I got to get out of town. Yeah, I'll be back in a month. And, he might grumble or whatever, but that's giving you the opportunity to really recalibrate and to make a plan and to call upon your social resources to the extent that you have them. But everybody's in a different situation with this. And lots of people, it's an incredibly common question, an incredibly common situation. Dr. Laura had a lot of calls about it. I talked to a lot of people who were in some kind of situation. And it's, the financial dependence is the most common explanation, but also, especially when you're dealing with agreeable people, particularly agreeable women, they're hanging on to these little crumbs of goodness about the person. And, they've gone through some tough times together, 42 years. Obviously, there's probably some adult kids involved. You have a history together, and the guy's not 100% a shithead. There's some redeeming qualities, and maybe you have some shared rituals and routines that really give you a lot of joy. And so women will hang on to these things and say, oh, but I really like watching TV with him at night, or he's really funny, or he's really supportive of my quilting, or whatever it is. And so a lot of what I'm doing when this comes up clinically is urging people to look at this situation, to not get too attached to those little crumbs, but to take it as a whole. You have to take this person as a whole. You have to look at the relationship from a more holistic perspective and run that cost-benefit analysis a little more coldly on the whole picture, not on the promise that you might have a good day, one more good day in 2 weeks, and then not another one for another 6 weeks. Like you can't link your happiness and your well-being to the promise of some crumbs like that. You really have to be more clear-eyed about it. So that's a trap that people will very often get into as well. But certainly, yeah, if it's nasty and directly abusive, especially physically abusive, then we call in some support from other humans.
Absolutely fascinating. Now, you mentioned traps, and so just right away, I'm thinking, if this lady happens to be agreeable, like sounds like in what you said she is, but also conscientious, where she's overestimating the worst case scenario, would a disagreeable person like this partner here provide some level of comfort to the Stone Age brain, essentially saying, hey, if there's ever an attack, this guy's going to look out for me. Whereas for 42 years, I've earned that protection, essentially. Whereas if I start over, I may not get any protection at all for the rest of my life.
Yeah. Oh, there's all kinds of stuff going on. I mean, if she's in her 60s and she's been with the same guy for 42 years, I mean, there's distortion on top of distortion on top of distortion, and there's some accuracy to some of that CB as well. So yes, if she's been free riding on a disagreeable partner for 42 years, and I have been in that position myself as a very agreeable person, there is great benefit in connecting yourself to someone more disagreeable, because they can provide that protection, and they can be the tough guy and basically improve your situation in life better than you could for yourself. So there's a trade there, and at some point it sounds like that became just the trade was no longer beneficial for her. But
hence
if
she's
in yeah, right, yeah. But if she's in her 60s and she's taking a hard look at her potential mate value, and she's running an analysis about how likely she is to find another mate who could, especially if she's financially dependent. People this is why people don't leave, because they look at the situation and they say, oh, well, God, I don't think I could get a job that could keep me at in the circumstances that I'm accustomed to. And I don't think that I could likely find another partner who would be able to, at least at an unconscious level, provide this kind of disagreeable protection racket that you're talking about, and everything else that comes along with this, the security and the comfort of a long-term relationship. So, the fact that she's still there and that she's been there for this long is not an accident. Her brain has been very accurately running these odds and running these expectations for 4 decades, and she's consistently come down to the computer has spit out the decision: we stay. And she's got dissonance and she's unhappy, and it's not an easy process to extract yourself from that. And it's really, you're weighing those trades that you're making, really, that are just representative of some degree, perhaps a very severe degree, of inconvenience. That's really what a lot of psychological problems come down to, is that you're not willing to pay the price of extreme inconvenience that making a different decision would entail. So in this case, that inconvenience could mean you have to live in a homeless shelter, because you don't have anywhere to live. He gets the house, you can't afford a job, there's nothing else that you can do. So that's a very high price, but it is the price. Like, everything has a price. And so part of her process is like really looking at that extreme scenario and asking herself if it's bad enough, is she willing to pay that extremely inconvenient price to, make a play for her actual moods of happiness in the remaining 10,000 days or whatever it is of her life, her 100,000 hours, as we're often referring to, because that's all you get. I don't know exactly how old she is, but just to remind people, this is the specter of 100,000 hours is the idea that if you're 60-ish or so, that's about what you're looking at if you expect to live an average lifespan. And that's it. And, one of those is getting taken away every hour, and you can't get it back. You can't earn more. So she has to really look at her time and her energy and how she's spending it and who she's spending it with. And if that is not worth the trade of pretty significant inconvenience, then it's not. But, maybe it is. So that only she can come to that decision.
That's great. I mean, we touched on this a little bit a couple podcast episodes ago, where, you just said that the cost-benefit analysis is working accurately, which, it sounds like it is. And yet she's feeling more depressed every year. And so it seems to me like there's that, on one hand, the calculator's working properly, but on the other hand, the future sensor is saying, this isn't great.
Yeah, well, there's internal conflicts of interest among her different value propositions, and the calculator works correctly for the individual, but the individual might be systematically skewed on a personality dimension like agreeableness or conscientiousness. So if you're a super hyper agreeable person, the CB runs correctly. The little calculator does its little process, and it's assigning high value to those things that are highly valued by agreeableness, because that's what it's programmed to do. So it produces a quote unquote correct result, but that result is it can be at odds with your happiness. So it's producing the right result for genetic success, but success and happiness are not the same thing. Like, they're very often not the same thing. So just because this is what beating your genes is about. So just because your genetic script is telling you that something is correct, it is correct to eat the pizza and the Twinkies instead of the vegetable soup and the kale salad. That is the correct choice to make for your survival and reproduction, because it's maximizing your time and your energy, and it's maximizing the motivational triad. But it's not the right recipe for success, or for happiness, excuse me. So success and happiness are diametrically opposed to each other in that example, and many, many, many others that we find ourselves in. So if she's projecting out the kind of life that those outcomes are going to secure for her, and she's feeling some depressed feelings about it, then that's a cue from the system that something is awry, that her genes are perhaps her genes, perhaps her situation, her financial situation, or whatever, or an abusive situation, or whatever it is, are leading her back into maintaining that equilibrium against the mandate of happiness.
All this talk of soup and salad and Twinkies, you're making me hungry, but I'm not going to tell you what I'm hungry for.
I don't know about a Twinkie salad. That's pretty that's pretty extreme. It's on the menu, the holiday menu at the Fasting Escape.
Water. Well, so the
many kinds of water.
So as far as genetics goes, would different genetics feel more depressed more quickly? So we'll say essentially a more stable lady here. Yep. She could go on for 42 years, whereas someone who's not that stable, she might not last for a year in this type of, or
sure. Yeah, I mean, the fact that she's stuck around for 42 years in a suboptimal situation tells us that she probably is fairly stable. She's packed her bags and she's thought about it, but she hasn't done it. So that's not telling us that there's a huge amount of impulsiveness in this person. So she, just from this question, knowing nothing about her and not meeting her and not knowing her full situation, I can read, high agreeable, high stable, high conscientiousness. That is the kind of person that's going to stay in a crappy relationship for 4 decades. So, and that's a tough combo. Like I have that combo as well. And I've stayed in shitty relationships way longer than I should have for very similar reasons. Some of it's personality distortion, some of it's economic distortion and situational, conflict of the sort that I'm talking about with financial dependence. But whatever it is, whatever she's dealing with, there is a path to get out, but it might entail some short-term or even long-term significant inconvenience and a lot of risk. You don't know that it's going to be better. There's no guarantee that you leave this relationship and it's hearts and flowers and cupcakes and rainbows all the way. Like, it may not be. It might be really crappy. Like, you might be living in a homeless shelter. You might be living with your sister for the rest of your life. Things, you might be really lonely and never find another relationship. And that would be the expectation, actually. That would be the norm for the species. And so, again, it's no accident that she's come down to staying in a suboptimal situation, because you run those odds and there are no guarantees, and it could be a worse situation on the other side of it. There's no promise of that, but what we do know is that this is pretty bad.
Wow.
Yeah, really cheerful stuff.
All right, our next question. Why is it that men flirt? I'm falling for a guy who's a huge flirt. I see him flirting with me and with other women, and he has a long-distance, long-term girlfriend who he is faithful to. Why does he flirt so much? Why am I falling for him even though I know he doesn't mean anything serious by flirting? Besides his flirting, he's actually a good person, good character, respectful, kind, intelligent, and diligent, and well-liked.
Well, he's, So yeah, sure. Men flirt, women flirt too. Lots of people flirt. Flirting is on a continuum like everything else, and it's like everything else in general. It's a mix of the genetic predisposition to flirt, i.e., what kind of personality you have, and a given context and environment, and the cost-benefit analysis that's associated with that context and environment. So this guy he's a big flirt, partly because he's a born flirt. So there's some degree of flirtatiousness inherent to his personality, which is really just probably that he's extroverted and open. That's what a flirtatious personality would be. Maybe agreeable, although I've known some pretty disagreeable flirts in my day. and so he's partly just congenitally a flirt, and then he's got enough opportunity to flirt in ways that make him feel good about his mate value without entailing much risk. So it sounds like, a lot of people will use flirting as a form of market testing. So people do this all the time. So if he's faithful to his long-term girlfriend, but he's going out there and he's flirting like crazy with this questioner and with everybody else, he's just really, above all, gathering market feedback to calibrate his mate value. He's putting his his sexual display out there, and he's seeing what kind of feedback that he's going to get. So that might mean that he's pondering defection on his relationship, but it might not. It might just mean that he is more interested in calibrating that than other people are. So different people will have all kinds of differences about how likely they are to do that. People have this idea that no matter how strong and stable and beautiful and mystical and idealized their pair bond is, that people aren't going to be sort of keeping one eye toward market testing. Of course they are. They're market testing all the time. And it's just a little more obvious in some cases, like this guy. He's gathering more data on an ongoing basis about whether there's a better opportunity for him out there. And there's nothing pathological about that. That is what we're wired to do. This is an endless competitive slog in the romantic arena and in the friendship arena and in the work arena. Qualification for a romantic relationship is a daily battle. It's not one and done. You don't just qualify for a relationship and that's it. You're qualifying every day for that relationship, and you're subject to market comparisons every day. So you'll see this advice in women's magazines. I've seen this for years that, the relationship is really in trouble when people stop courting each other, which is this big cliche, but it's actually very true. So that really is the process of attempting to continually qualify for your mate. That is what courtship is. And so this guy, we don't know his particular motivations and his particular feelings about his long-term pair bond and how seriously he's considering defection, but he is just on the continuum of significant market testing, and he's a little more of a social butterfly and a little bigger flirt, and so you're just going to see a lot of that behavior from him. So it's understandable that she would be falling for him behind that.
Yeah, this magazine you just brought up, the Cosmo magazines where they say courtship starts, or if courtship stops, then the relationship ends. So yeah, it's fascinating because I've learned from you and Dr. Lisle that when the courtship stops, it's not that you have to start it up again. It's that the reason why it stopped is because you were less motivated to try to qualify for that person anymore. Is that
exactly right? Right. Yeah. But that a lot of that comes from this notion that it's, qualification is not an ongoing process, or that you don't in principle have rivals, or you have a false sense of security. So the only way that you could have a true sense of security is if you've settled so far down the scale that you have somebody, that you're partnered with somebody who is so over rewarded that it's not going to be an issue no matter how little effort you put into the thing. But that's very unlikely.
Or if you sign a government contract that makes it very difficult to get out of the relationship, right?
I have no idea what you're referring to. we're not gonna sling mud at marriage on this podcast, Nathan.
Fair enough. It's more about barriers to exit.
But yes,
that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yes. No. Very, very fair point. But yeah, I mean, there's always, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship or a work relationship, there's always somebody younger and better looking and more talented and willing to do more work for less money coming up on your heels. This is the competition does not stop in any of these arenas ever. So you can feel temporarily very secure and you can feel like you found your soulmate and all of that. But the fact is that there's continual market testing happening constantly in all of those competitive domains. And it's just that some people are a little more aggressive about making that obvious, i.e. through something like a flirtatious process. So other people are much more subtle about it. Other people are less sensitized to it and are, especially if they're more agreeable and more stable, like our previous questioner, they're more content in a relationship for a longer period of time. They're less likely to be seeking any kind of recalibration. So there's all kinds of variation all over the place, but everybody's on the continuum somewhere as far as market calibration.
And to people who say, gosh, Dr. Hawk, this sounds depressing and, so cynical. Why?
Yeah.
What's the point if someone's always going to be looking through one eye about somebody better? Like, what would you say to that?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions in evolutionary psychology that sort of come down to that kind of idea. And it's like, well, would you rather stick your head in the sand about these dynamics and pretend that they don't exist? Or would you rather be informed and be able to build your life and make choices according to these tenets of human dynamics and human relationships? Like, I would rather be informed, even if it's depressing and cynical, and it's like, yeah, well, it's kind of like, yeah, this is not great news. Like, you do have to qualify every day, even if you've found your soulmate. So it's just the way that it is. And I am a truth-seeking kind of person who wants to be informed rather than just pretend it's not a process. So, but that's up to everybody to decide for themselves. And there's no end of findings throughout behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology that are equally sort of anxiety inducing, especially for women over a certain age. So it does. There's a reason you don't see a lot of women in this field.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole nother Pandora's box, I guess.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yes.
Well.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we're just keeping it cheerful here.
Right on time for the new year too. I mean, just nothing better.
That's right.
Yeah.
Happy New Year, everybody. Good luck in that endless competition we call life.
But actually,
what is the line? What's the line from the Hunger
Games? May the odds be ever in your favor.
Ever in your favor, is that what it is? Yeah. So that's kind of the vibe here.
but I guess to spin this around in a more positive light, more optimistic light, is that once we know that there is a competition and what the rules are essentially, or what the competition entails and what's allowed in this competition, really the next step is to just get to work, roll up the shirt sleeves and get to work on the fundamentals. And even if we don't achieve everything that we wanted, even if we don't get the results that we wanted, the process, getting lost in that process and feeling good, that's going to make us feel good about ourselves.
Yes, that is the secret to happiness right there, the way that you've described it. But of course that is, that scenario is competing with all of the different little traps that we've talked about on many different episodes, and all of these inclinations that people have for very good reason to avoid and dodge and bluff competition. So there's no shortage of ways in the modern environment in particular that we can avoid these competitive processes, or pretend to avoid them, or pretend that we don't even want to compete. The enlightenment trap, all the different faces of the ego trap, all kinds of victimhood narratives, all sorts of ways that we can try to remove ourselves from this endless swirling storm of insecurity and competition. And rightfully so, because it's like, who wants to... It takes a very particular sort of nervous system to dive into that wholeheartedly and say, well, yep, I'm gonna do my best, and I'm gonna play honestly and fairly and let the chips fall where they may. Like that is what we need to do to optimize our life experience. But that is not the average inclination of the species as a whole to take to that naturally. That's we are much more naturally inclined to try to make life a little bit easier and softer and gentler for ourselves, and to conserve energy, of course. Right? But a lot of a lot of the traps, though, like a lot of the faces of the ego trap, part of how they're operating is that they appear to be more energy conserving than they really are. So you think you're getting away with something through avoiding competition or bluffing that you want nothing to do with competition, and it mimics energy conservation.
I think it's not that much until years later.
Yeah. Very similar sort of problem. Yeah. It's like, oh, this isn't real money at all. But yeah, you're really undermining your happiness in the process, and you wake up one day and you realize that you've missed out on your life because you've just been spending all of your time trying to avoid competition. So that's not ideally what we want to do, but we're really fighting the genes at every level to make the right decision.
I like this. We brought it back around to more positive light for the start of the new year. So this... Yeah.
That's right. This is a little bit of a pep talk. Go out there and do your best, kids.
All right, our next question. How is it that you deal with toxic and controlling parents who like to believe that they are doing right by continuing to control your life well into your adulthood? Is it normal to feel that you have a hate relationship with your mother because of lack of support and love to you? As a daughter, it feels awful to feel it this way, but I can't get over the fact that having a distant and uncaring mother has driven me into agreeing to marry a person who's totally different to me in personality. Even to this date, my mother still emotionally blackmails me to not get a divorce by using her health as a reason. You can divorce your spouse, but how can you even divorce your mother and get over it without feeling the guilt? A few times I tried to talk this with my friends, but it's only alienated me.
Yeah, well, this is very similar to our first question. I mean, you can divorce your parents. You just don't want to. They're just like with our lady who is with the lousy husband. There are very stable cost-benefit equilibria that are operating here. So you're maintaining this less than ideal relationship with this emotionally blackmailing person out of some kind of perceived necessity or self-interest or personality distortion or whatever has been plugged into that CB for in your particular case. So the late great Harry Brown has a wonderful line here that I always love, which is that they can't stop you, which is to say nobody can stop you. Nobody can really stop you from doing anything. It just comes back to this point that I was making earlier about whether you're willing to pay that price of inconvenience or not. So you're staying in a bad relationship with a parent. Really, there's no real principal difference here than staying in a bad relationship with a spouse. So there is a little bit of genetic affiliation. You do have you're sharing genes with them, obviously, which makes it a stronger connection. But there's no magical quality of a parental relationship that makes it any. You're not obligated by some sort of divine mandate to preserve a relationship with a bad parent. You just don't want to. You have not wanted to until now, and so you maintain this relationship, and you're paying a very high cost, not just with a bad relationship with your mom, but by also being in an unhappy marriage because you don't want to be subject to your mom's manipulation about that. So this is a multi-dimensional bad scenario. And I guess my advice would be, I mean, she's asking how you can divorce your mother and get over it without feeling the guilt. That's unlikely. You probably will feel some guilt, depending on what kind of personality you're working with and how conscientious you are. And you're going to continue to have some sort of feelings about it that might be a little uncomfortable. And so in this case, that's the price. The price is living with those uncomfortable feelings, but the trade is getting your life back and experiencing relationships that you actually deserve and that bring you happiness. So until now, you have not been willing to feel those feelings of guilt. Well, okay, that's fine. That's a fine equilibria to come to. But that is where it is because of that willingness to pay with those feelings. So you're in a position where you either accept that that's the case, or you accept that you're going to pay that price, or you just accept that you're going to live with these bad relationships. I realize that feels like there's no good choice there, but we can't really change reality around to fit our desires in that way. So, my advice would be the same as it was with the spouse, which is, you don't have to make a big decision when a smaller decision would do. So with a disagreeable parent, just like a disagreeable spouse or a disagreeable friend, it rarely is the right strategy to make a big deal out of this and to make a big declaration and to have a big fight. It's usually a much better strategy to just fade to black on these people, and to pursue what Dr. Lisle and I call the disagreeable distance. And so you're just withholding, you're just reclaiming your time and energy from this person, whether it's a parent or anybody else, so that you can start actually putting that time and energy into your own life instead of this relationship. And then you just fade and you fade and you fade, and they may squawk and try to engage you in conflict over it, and you just kind of shine them on a little bit and continue to fade, and eventually they run the CB, and they don't have as much interest in as in trying to enmesh you in that as they initially do. So that would be the first strategy to pursue. And if that doesn't work, we can look at other things. But that's where I would start.
It's fascinating because, Dr. Lisle's approach, your approach, is you explain that there's a competition and there's a cost-benefit analysis, and then you just go through the little details of how to get this thing, how to essentially get this thing played out, depending on what the person needs. So different than some of the psychologists that I've heard about through different patients and friends and family and all that.
Oh yeah. I would love to, nothing more than to just sit here and talk smack about psychodynamic therapy for, another hour. It's such a waste of time. It's not just a waste of time, but it's actively sabotaging people's life experiences because it's holding them captive in this relationship with an exploitative therapist who is just trying to get them to come back next week, and to cash their next check because, if we didn't get to the heart of all of the childhood issues that have directed your life into this situation today, then by golly, next week we'll dig a little deeper and we'll peel that onion back a little further, and we just better talk about this more and more and more and spend a lot more of your money in the process. So it's like a parasitical relationship that is actively contributing to the distortion that people have that is preventing them from making the kinds of decisions that we are talking about in terms of like actually looking very coldly at your situation, and weighing that CB in a more accurate way rather than one that is completely encumbered by all of the psychodynamic BS that is untrue and irrelevant, but is being confirmed to you as very relevant by a charlatan therapist. So look at that. The Hulk came out again.
Well,
You're making me so... I get angry.
Well, I guess what I was trying to say is that if people have questions, they can schedule phone consults with you because you can break this thing down and
Yes.
help them out step by step, and get the problem solved rather than just talking about the problem and never being able to figure out what the problem actually is.
Yes. Yes, we really think of ourselves more as mechanics in that way. Like there's almost always, not to say that there aren't some very serious intractable problems. Dr. Lisle breaks the world into real problems and BS problems. And there are not that many real problems, but there are some. Terminal disease, and a couple of other things. But most problems of the sort that people are writing in about, and these relationship issues and parental and spouse problems, all this kind of thing. These are problems of being willing to pay the price to change that dynamic. And you are in a very stable situation because you have not been willing to pay the price. And there's a good reason for that, almost certainly. But if there's some kind of distortion in that mix, then it's our job to help you understand what that is and to get clear about what you're really looking at and what the situation really is. And if there is a better choice to make, then how we would go about making it. So in cases like that, there is always a way out. There's always a way out. We can always find the path out of the forest, but it might be fraught with great peril. A few thorns, a few rodents of unusual size.
Oh, no, those, I don't think they exist.
It's the fire swamp.
All right. Our last question.
We know how that will go for you.
All right. A friend of mine is having some troubles getting in touch with his friends regularly. He always thinks that if I or anyone else doesn't contact him first, that I don't like him anymore. It seems to me like he's suffering from some kind of inferiority complex in that sense. How do you explain such a behavior in an evolutionary sense, or to broaden my question, why do people suffer from inferiority complexes and how can they try to overcome such feelings?
I'm not quite sure I understand the dynamics of the question. So he thinks he doesn't initiate contact with his friends because he's thinking if he has to do that,
a friend
first,
of
then
his
they don't
is
care.
Like that. So he's asking for a friend, essentially.
Yeah, right. Right, you're right. Asking for a friend. Yeah, I would chalk that up just to again to personality. I mean, there are, it's on the continuum that people are, especially on this continuum of emotional stability, that some people just require more reassurance than others. And I've certainly had friends all over the continuum here who kind of subject you to these little tests in this way. So they're kind of testing to see, oh, are you going to reach out to me? And if I don't reach out to you for a week, will you even notice? Or will that make a difference? And will you reach out to, like, all this kind of stuff goes on. And it's people, again, market testing their place in the coalition, in the friendship coalition. They're looking for evidence that they are valued and that they belong. And some people are more coalition deficient in that way than others. And some people are going to be, especially less stable people who are feeling a little more emotionally volatile in this dimension, are going to engage in this kind of practice more often. So I would expect that that's probably what's going on here. It's also energy conservation, where he's, why reach out to friends and if they're going to reach out to me first? Like, I'll just sit back and wait for the invitations to roll in. So I don't know that if there's an inferiority complex necessarily. I think there's just a little bit of status deficiency and a very high need for reassurance in that particular animal. Yeah. One of my dogs is like that.
Yeah, and can you talk a little more about, what inferiority complex seems like one of those pop psychology phrases?
Yeah. Well, I think we talked a little bit about, when we talked about the imposter complex a couple of weeks ago or a month or two ago, we sort of we danced around some of those same ideas. So yeah, this is a pop psychology term for the interaction of certain personalities in certain environmental contexts. So this is just like broken record here, but this is what it is. So everybody is on a continuum with their personality characteristics that are going to make them more or less likely to exhibit these sorts of traits that we would label an inferiority complex. So somebody who's more agreeable, somebody who's less emotionally stable, those are people who are perhaps more conscientious. This is kind of depends on what we'd want to be more precise about what we're labeling as an inferiority complex. But just like the imposter complex was, imposter complex is more likely to show up in people who are more agreeable and more conscientious. You don't see anybody suffering from a so-called imposter complex who is very low conscientious and very disagreeable. They don't really have that capacity that existing in their nervous system to be expressed. But if you do have the capacity to be expressed, whether it's for imposter syndrome or inferiority complex or anything else, and you put that personality in just the right conditions to express itself, then you could very likely see some sort of manifestation of these traits that we could give a name, like an inferiority complex. So if he is in relationships, if this guy who has the inferiority complex has those personality traits to begin with and finds himself in relationships where he's a little bit over rewarded, and he feels like he's not worthy of the relationships that he's in, whether they're romantic or friendship or anything else, then he's more likely to manifest those traits, and we're more likely to look at that person and say, oh, they've got an inferiority complex, when really they're just kind of in a position of weakness in their life, and they're a little bit inclined to be a little meek and a little retreating and a little uncertain of themselves just by their nature.